Tech Reimagined, redefining the relationship between people and technology. Brought to you by Endava. This is Tech Reimagined.
Hello and welcome back. I'm Bradley Howard and you're listening to Tech Reimagined, the podcast that explores how technology influences the fabric of our society, changing the ways we work, we live and we do business. Each week we speak to the leading lights of the technology world and dive deep into the biggest topics in the business. You can find us on every podcast platform that matters. Today, I'm speaking to a colleague of mine from Endava, Eoin Woods, our Chief Technology Officer or CTO. Outside of his many professional endeavours, Eoin is also an enthusiastic amateur trumpet player and is also passionate about anything to do with an engine that moves very quickly, to quote his short autobiography. Today, I'm here to discover a little bit more about the perspective of a leader in the technology world and the responsibilities and the challenges that come with heading up such a crucial part of a large technology business operation. Hello, Eoin. How are you today?
Hello, Bradley. Thanks for the invitation. It's very nice to be here. I'm great. How are you doing?
Welcome on board. I'm fine, thank you. So can you tell us about your main responsibilities as the CTO of Endava?
Yes, of course. Well, the first thing I have to say is that the term CTO must be the most confusing in the entire technological world. You find CTOs all over the place with completely different responsibilities. So as soon as I meet somebody who's also called CTO, the first thing I always say, and we normally joke about, is, what do you do? It's probably nothing like what I do. I'm a CTO in a software services company. So Endava and other companies like us, a number of us have CTOs, and actually these kind of CTOs all do the same kinds of things. I'm responsible for two main things. One is I'm responsible for making sure that Endava has the right capability. That is, our people have the right skills, the right tools, and the right ways of working to make sure we deliver great results for clients across the huge range of work that we do, both internationally, across problem domains, across industries, across technologies. The other thing I'm accountable for is innovation. I try and foster innovation across the firm, working with my group, which is a group of our most senior engineers and technologists. And that we run an innovation community and also, as you know, a series of high-profile hackathons that we call the Innovation Labs.
I'm really looking forward to talking about innovation separately a bit later on. But right now, so you've got quite a lot of experience working in the world of software engineering. What do you think is the most significant difference between today's technology landscape and when you started out?
In some ways, everything's changed. In other ways, nothing's changed. We still need to solve problems without enough time and without enough money, like any branch of engineering. There's an old phrase, isn't there? An engineer is someone who can do for $1 what any fool can do for $10. And I think that hasn't changed right through the 25 or so years I've been doing this. And what I have seen, though, is that we reuse so much more software today. When I started out, we were writing software with systems like Unix was a new thing back then, believe it or not. C was quite established, but in many companies was seen as very innovative. We started off with pretty well an operating system on a machine with a compiler and maybe a few libraries, and we built everything from scratch pretty well. Today, you look at the riches that there are, particularly in open source software, cloud platforms that provide us with lots of sophisticated facilities we can plug together, and lots of reusable software that's also available commercially. Some of it across the internet, and some of it we download and buy commercially. There's still a definite market for that. And what this has led to is a lot more quite standard patterns for how we develop certain kinds of systems. If somebody starts building a web application today, they don't really need to start from the absolute fundamentals of what are the pieces of a web application, what does it need to achieve, how do I put the bits together. There's lots of frameworks that pretty well generate you an empty web app out of the box, and you can start focus on your problem as opposed to the reusable generic stuff. The other thing I think has changed quite a bit is the expectations. When I started out, we all liked to think that we were perfectionists. Our software was always going to be perfect. In fact, back then, I think there was a fixation of making software perfect rather than effective. But you look at the kind of reliability we needed to achieve or the level of defects that people expected. We got away with quite a lot. I remember building applications, even 10, 15 years ago, where they had to work, when people said it has to work all the time, they meant, from about 8 till about 5 or 6 days a week. Whereas now, our guys, nearly all of our teams are building systems you just can't switch off. So those are the things really, is that we reuse a lot more software. There's a lot more standard ways of doing things, which is great because they increase velocity and they improve reliability. But also, the flip side is we need to build software that's just much more reliable, secure, performance stable, straight out of the box.
A question that I've asked you and your direct reports a few times is, how do you personally stay up to date with the latest technology trends and the latest tools and techniques? Because it just changes so quickly in so many different ways.
It's a constant tussle. But of course, I always say this when I give my technology trends talk. On the one hand, everything's changing all the time. On the other hand, the underlying principles of how it all works don't change nearly as fast. So the way that I personally go about it, and I think many of my really senior guys do as well, is that we make sure that we're constantly reminding ourselves what the fundamentals are, and then we learn incrementally, in effect by difference. It's this new thing has arrived. How does it relate to everything that I've actually built up lots of experience with? And then we sort of learn the differences and what makes it unique and interesting, rather than trying to learn every detail of it. And that really helps us also keep the technology landscapes in our heads to allow us to put them in context when we talk to clients or internal teams.
You've worked from both what we would call client side in some financial services institutions and also from what we would call supplier side, Endava, for example. How has that distinction influenced your working philosophy and your methodologies as well?
It's really very different. And I know you've spent most of your career working serving clients, and that's one mindset. And then when you sit on, you don't think of yourself as the client side, you think of yourself as the side, working for the client. It's quite different, because on the client side, you own everything and ultimately you're accountable for everything. But you know that you don't necessarily have the skills, the knowledge, the capacity to solve it. On our side of the fence, we're trying to make the client successful, but ultimately it's not our business we're trying to make successful. So on the client side, you've got all the knowledge and all of the accountability about what has to happen from a business perspective, but you actually may not be able to do it yourself. So that's one very empowering and also slightly disconcerting, is that you're relying on a third party. From our perspective as suppliers, we're desperately trying to understand as much as we can about the client side, and that varies hugely by client. As you know, some clients share everything with us, some are very careful about what they share with us. And so we're always trying to fill in the gaps to understand what the client really needs, as opposed to perhaps what we've been asked for in the last week. So it's a strange dance between the two. But it really is why we see again and again at Endava why clients who engage with us in a genuine partnership get so much more out of us than treating us as somebody that they have a contract with.
That is so true, isn't it? That if you understand what the bigger picture is and what the ultimate aim is, you start being able to fill in some of the blanks, as opposed to probably like any supplier, if you're just given piecemeal parts of the puzzle and told, now go produce that part, the widget, this piece, it's just really difficult to know what the ultimate aim is of what our piece of work is trying to do, isn't it? So I know that one of your key specialties as an engineer is in the field of software architecture, so much so you've written the book on it. So as a CTO, is it a case of setting top-line strategy and letting delivery staff implement it, or do you personally intervene in a lot of projects?
So what my group try and do is make sure that people have the capabilities they need to deliver good results. Our primary role isn't actually to work on projects, though we do work on projects fairly routinely. In terms of architecture specifically, we have an architecture discipline. We have 12 professional disciplines that all of our staff fit into, and architecture is one of those. So in fact, when I'm a CTO, I oversee all the disciplines. I try and make sure that they're all progressing at the speed the business needs, that we're building the capabilities that we need, that we're building healthy culture, that we're helping people to be the best that they can be, as we say at Endava. If I go and work on a project, it's a flipped relationship. I'm actually accountable to Christina Cooper-Bland, who is our group head of architecture, for the architecture work I do to make sure that I don't let the discipline down. So it's two totally different relationships with both internally and with the clients, depending on whether I'm working on the project or whether I'm trying to make sure that we have the right capability to make sure we produce the results for the client.
How do you try and divide the time between working on a client project and internal systems?
Realistically, today, I spend relatively little time on client projects. When I'm working on a client project, it's a couple of days a week, but I only do a couple of them a year. Some of them are quite long running, though. I recently came off one I've been involved with for a year, which was a great experience. And the way it really works is that Endava is full of very capable people, many much more capable than me. But occasionally something comes in that has a particularly Owen-shaped hole that has to be filled, and if I can make the time, I'll often get an approach from the client team to say, this appears to have a U-shaped hole, would you come and help? And I'll always try and help if I can.
And across Endava, we serve lots of different industries. Do you see trends in technology trends in one industry keeping pace with others, or do you see each different industry kind of focusing on one particular different technology trend?
At the broad level, if you took sort of, say, banking, capital markets as a vertical versus logistics and mobility versus healthcare, actually they move relatively independently. There are generic technology trends, such as some years ago there was the move to mobile. More recently, the last 3 to 5 years, there's been the move to cloud. But if you take cloud as an example, I think if you look at how the e-commerce industry moved, the retail industry in general actually adopted cloud versus how healthcare adopted cloud versus how insurance looks at cloud, how banking capital markets reacted to cloud, they all sort of, they fought in packs, if you like. The insurance industry moved to cloud, not in lockstep by any means, but broadly as a wave. And that wave was relatively disconnected from, say, the retail industry's move to cloud.
And do you also see that the consumerisation of what we used to call B2B applications, has that changed in particular industries?
I think quite a lot of industries have quite reluctantly realised that B2B now has to be just as cost-effective, easy to service, user-friendly, powerful as B2C, which was something of an annoyance to them because for many years they got away with quite poor user interfaces, quite basic business flows, lots of manual exception handling, and they've realised those days are over. When I worked for a large bank, we used to have this joke that we could tell what the technology trend for the next year would be early in January. The reason was that all the really senior managers would turn up with the latest electronic consumer device and say, could I have something like this in the internal systems? And the answer was regrettably normally no, because you haven't funded us to nearly the right level to recreate Facebook internally. But that was definitely how mobile came into the bank. It was there was a wave of really senior managers getting iPads at Christmas. They all arrived in January and independently all said to their tech teams, right, if you could just put all the critical apps on this, that would be great. This is all I'm going to use going forwards. So you can imagine everyone's face dropped as they thought how they were going to take their 10-year-old heavyweight rich user interfaces and put them on mobile. But actually it did happen. It did take time, but it did get consumerized, as you put it. Those internal employee interfaces, suddenly the bar was raised, which was fantastic for technology and ultimately fantastic for the business.
So aside from your technical skills as a CTO, what are the key soft skills that you need in order to be a successful CTO?
I think the thing for me, it happens early on the career path, is that technical people start out worrying about technicalities, and they're quite right to, because that's what they bring to the party early in their career. At some point, successful ones realise that people matter. And I'm really proud of Endava of how early in people's careers we invest in them, in their language skills and their people skills and their understanding of organisations and their understanding of dynamics between people, because relatively junior people start to learn this early, so it becomes second nature, which I think is one of the reasons our teams work together really well. For me, that was quite a slow journey. I remember distinctly resisting any sort of soft skills training and people training for the first 3 or 4 years of my career. But I was lucky enough to be mentored by a very senior engineering director at the company I was at the time, a lady called Kim Lambert, who was only just retired from the industry now after a very distinguished career in UK IT. And I remember Kim, I suppose, met me every 3 or 4 months. And in one of these meetings, she sort of sat me down and said, you've just got to understand, you don't like the word management, but you're never going to get anything done that involves other people unless you learn how to manage them. And it was like this penny dropped eventually, because I kind of went, oh yeah, I sort of get it now. But it took a long time for me to realise that. And then I just had to embrace people skills. I do think that's the thing that, it's a bit of a cliche, but the ability to influence other people, the ability to absolutely key one for any engineer is to communicate complicated ideas simply without making them sound complicated. The ability to persuade rather than to try and argue or override somebody, the ability to empathise, to understand the other point of view. These things are very important because there'll be an awful lot of persuasion, cooperation and collaboration in any successful technical career.
You mentioned mentoring before, which is really interesting. And have you had any other mentors within your career?
I've had a number of informal ones. People I've bounced off of, people I've admired. When I joined a large bank, there was, in fact, there were a couple of really successful technical architects there. I learned a lot from them. A little bit about architecture, but a lot more about how you operate in a really big company, which I'd I'd done in-depth technical work in quite large places, but not at a very senior level. And they gave me a lot of insight into, I wouldn't, calling it politics makes it sound very negative, but simply how the organization works. If you're going to be successful, the following people are going to have to understand your idea and think it's a really good idea to the point where they start pretending they thought of it. It's tips like that that are just invaluable to actually get it stuff done.
And how did you find coming from what was a very large financial services organisation to Endava? And how big was Endava when you first joined?
Oh, it was about 1,700 people, I think. So yes, I come from, I think we had been 86,000 and we were a bit smaller as I was leaving, and they're a bit smaller again now, a bit more focused. Yes, well, I had worked smaller places. I'd worked places that actually were smaller than Endava for short periods. So I partly knew what to expect, but there was the biggest culture shock actually was because Endava even back then was a high growth firm. And it was the number of people who came up to me in my first couple of weeks and were trying to help me understand the firm. And there's a number of people who didn't know where I come from said things like, you have to understand we're now quite a big firm. And I used to just look at them and go, you're smaller than one of the departments I used to have accountability for. So the thing that I think was great about it, and I had worked for Barclays Global Investors before they were sucked into BlackRock, and they were about 8,000 people, which again dramatically smaller than UBS, was the thing that I really liked about BGI and then at Endava was you could know everyone you needed to know to get something done. In a big organization, because things constantly change and there are so many people, you cannot possibly know all the people you will need to influence. So you have to get much better at working with people you don't know very well. And the lovely thing about Endava when I joined was people like you were incredibly welcoming. I got to know people very quickly, and you realized what people did and how they worked together and the kind of people they were, and you could quite quickly sort of put together the map of people who you had to go and talk to if you wanted to get something done. And that was just so liberating to be able to do that on a single sheet of paper.
And now that we're around 12,000 people, are you starting to remember some of those skills that you had working for larger organizations?
There is a bit of it. I'd say we're nowhere near the big organizations. The key thing that Endava realized implicitly or explicitly a long time ago was that federation is very powerful. The same organizational lesson that Amazon learned very quickly as they scaled. So the great thing about Endava is we empower parts of the organization to just go off and be successful, but using a standard model. So that means that I know what the organizational structure will be. I can navigate it very quickly if I don't know the individuals. Whereas in a really big organization, there are all these baroque structures that are all different. And somebody introduces themselves as, I'm the assistant chief operating officer for fixed income derivatives at North America Southern Division. And you go, and what do you do? I have no idea what you do because I've never heard that job title before. And we're sat in Endava, in fact, we have delivery locations, we have account group units, we have sectors, we have regions, we have local heads, we have group heads. We know how the organisation works, and we've replicated it really successfully. So that helps a lot. But of course, we are a lot bigger. So yes, a few of those organisational navigation skills do come in handy.
So let's say someone is listening to this today and they've just been promoted to a CTO. What's your top tips and advice for them?
Find out what is important to the organisation, and find out how you can do something that really interests you but has an effect towards those goals. It may be something that is wrong with the organisation. I worked for UBS twice, actually, my previous employer. My second time with them, I was hired specifically because there was a problem in a particular area of the bank. Sometimes there's something needs to be fixed. In other cases, it's more that the organisation wants to be better at something or wants to go and do something new. Work out what that overarching goal is, and then work out with your skills, interests, abilities, everything else, what is it that you can do to move towards that goal. It's quite easy, I think, for people to come into senior roles, and I've seen this in large organisations. They come in effectively having worked out what they think is the optimum game plan before they've talked to anyone. And then they talk about their first 100 days, when actually they should be quiet and listening in their first 100 days. And actually they're desperate to have an impact. So they start trying to move pieces around the chessboard in the first 100 days, not understanding any of the relationships. I've very rarely seen that be successful. And so I think it's find out what the organization's trying to do, listen a lot, and then work out how your unique profile allows you to help the organization get there.
We've heard sort of similar responses from previous guests as well. I remember Damien Gabil, we said, so what do you do when you become the CEO or the chairperson for a new organization? And she said pretty much the same thing. Lots and lots of research. There's so much available publicly. I just do lots of research and absorb the information before starting to work out what to do next. Definitely very consistent there. So you're a keen trumpeter and fast car enthusiast. How do those hobbies help you in your day-to-day life as CTO?
Well, the main reason is they're completely different. Though I was thinking about that before this call, and I thought, well, it's funny. Software is now so ubiquitous that it even sort of impinges on music and on being a motoring enthusiast. There's an app for everything. Years ago, we used to send emails around, or we even used to have notice boards in rehearsal rooms to work out who could play at different gigs. Of course, now there's an app for that. It's called Musudo, and nearly all music groups in the UK use it. And you go and you see the engagements coming up, and you indicate your availability, and we can shape the band depending on who's available. But really, it is that they're very different, and the two hobbies themselves are very different. Although I love driving, I don't participate in motorsport, though my daughter is a karter. But I'm very much an observer, and I really love that, and I love seeing the personalities and everything that's happening there. Music, I'm very involved, but the really nice thing about music is, honestly, I'm not that good at it. And that means that I'm quite happy to play second or third trumpet or play whatever position is needed and have somebody else tell me what to do. I'm perfectly happy to do that because it's completely different to work where normally people are looking at me and saying, what's the answer? It's sometimes quite nice to be in an environment where you go, I don't know what the answer is and it doesn't matter. Somebody else knows the answer.
What job would you have had if you didn't become a CTO?
That's a great question. Honestly, I don't know. I've always, from the time I graduated, really, I knew I wanted to be something senior and technical, which was more about the software than primarily managing people and money, which is why I've always stayed away from the delivery management, project management stream of work. I was a development manager for a bit. As I like to joke, that was at a large bank. I did it for just long enough to prove to myself and the team that this was a bad idea. And then I went scuttling back to architecture, I think to everyone's relief. And right through my career, my role models have been those really senior technical people. I nearly became a musician. I think for the world of music and myself, it was just as well I didn't. But I nearly became a professional musician. But I really don't know. I think I probably would have ended up doing a job that was technical in some form, even if it wasn't software technical, because I'm very good. Probably my only real differentiating skill is I'm good with models of different sorts, visual models and mathematical models and conceptual models. So yeah, I'd probably have ended up in some parallel industry that needs people who can deal with abstract concepts. But which one? I'm really not sure.
My final question, if people want to get in contact with you, what's the best way, either on social media or another network?
Sure, well, of course, I'm eoin.woods@endava.com for an email, but I have my own website, eoinwoods.info, which of course is spelled EoinWoods.info, which is not immediately obvious. And I'm on Twitter and Mastodon and LinkedIn. So if you go to my website, all the links are there for social media.
Eoin, thank you so much for joining us and giving us the insight into life as a CTO. It was really enlightening to hear your perspective on leading a large and growing organisation. To all of our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this latest episode of Season 3 of the Tech Reimagined podcast. You know where you can find us, and that's on all the major podcast platforms. We'll be back next week with another journey into the most urgent topics in technology.